So I got a couple sheepskin muffs here. This one is the large, might make that the extra large size. And this one gets real fluffy. And you can trim the hair on the inside if you need it, not quite so tight. But this is the medium size. I'm a large and I can still kind of get my hands in there. You do a fur all the way across, and this is basically the same pattern. It's just that cuff goes all the way to the center, so you can have it fully covered. And one more thing I'll mention, I did make this pattern so that sheepskin could be all the way around, real warm. And then I had a separate one if you just wanted the fold. With this style of pattern, you're seeing some of the stitches and stuff. You can do this pattern, or you can take this pattern and just flip it inside out. And that will give you a little more space on the inside if you don't mind having the skin on the inside. So if you want it really warm, I suggest going with this one because that's got it all the way around. Or you can do that, flip it, and then just do those folds inward. And you can tack them down to keep the folds in there so that it's more like that. And you can do that with either style of sheepskin. And again, it will say in the pattern. The only thing to keep in mind is the sizing will be about the same because of that fold. However, on the very inside, if you're doing this and flipping it, you'll have a little bit more room in there. Since I've covered how to cut your patterns out, how to cut your sheepskin parts out many times over with a lot of my other videos, I'm skipping ahead with this one. If you've never made anything out of sheepskin with my patterns, I suggest going back and watch the Sheepskin Mitten pattern. It'll look a lot like this one. And that'll talk about what pens to use, how to trim stuff up if you want, and everything you'll need to know before you get started with this. So if you did want to sew these on a machine instead of by hand, you can pinch them together. You basically just grab them and pinch them together and sew a straight line. Or you can tuck it down in there. That's kind of what I did with this one since I didn't want that extra seam width. But this was mostly sewn by machine, and I finished it up by hand to show you how I would do that in the end. But there's multiple ways you could sew this. There's a couple ways you can sew this. Like my hat patterns and stuff, I've always been doing them like this way, either a single whip or whipping back the whip stitch. So it has that cross. However, you can do this, basically to do this method. And once you get it done, you can pull out a little bit more if you need to. Looks all right. I usually don't do that. But for that, you just butt them up against each other, the wool sides, and you're just going to sew back and forth, or you can do it on a machine. That'll whip these out real quick. I almost always do this kind of stitch, either the single or double. And for that, you butt these up against each other. And when we start on these, you're going to want to start on this short side here, because that's going to fold over and hide the knots that we're going to be making. So you just want to get the wool out of the way. Using clips always helps. And I'll just kind of look at these holes and make sure they're straight across as I come down and put a couple more on here. I'll start by tying a knot. Whenever I tie these knots, I like to go through twice. It just locks it in a little bit better. And then right now the knot's on top, so what I'll do is go through that same hole so we can slide that knot right up against the other side so that it won't loosen up over time. And being that this is the side that's going to fold over, I want to go around the outside of it as well. It just holds those ends together real nice. And we won't be doing that on this side because you'll see how these corners eventually come together. It'll look a little bit better. But after you get that started and the knot slid all the way up to that, you just keep whip stitching around the top. And I like to take a look and make sure it kind of goes over straight. You're going to pull them good and tight, but don't wrench on it. You could rip through these holes. Again, I'm taking a look at those holes so they match up before I throw a clip on here. You can use the needle to get that wool out of the way a little more. And we'll just go all the way down to the other end here. And you can stop and tie a knot at that point, do the single whip stitch. However, I like to come back on stuff like this and mittens. I find it's a little bit more durable. I like how it looks as well. It'd be helpful to kind of pinch those sides together. If I'm stopping and taking a break, I'll throw a clip on those just to keep them from loosening up. Another thing to keep in mind is if you go into that first hole and you're aiming way down and then you pick it up, you're going to grab a lot of that wool. So if anything, I try to have it angled up a little so that I press the wool down when I come through that next hole. You can also see that the holes will start to misalign a little bit because of that twist. Will pull it out of whack a little. But as long as you keep an eye on those holes and don't miss any, you'll be just fine. It can also be helpful to throw something underneath that seam so it's not so flat and you're not fighting to get in there. So this is the side, that short, that will be folded over for the cuff. This is the side that will be sewn to the other ones that we're going to sew together. So what I don't do is go around the outside. I like how the corner looks a little better. You can if you want. But with that said, I still do go through that like I would, but go also a second time and go just over the top straight. I find it just kind of holds it a little bit nicer. But so with this, we're going to fall back through and just watch it so it crosses over the top nice, makes that nice X pattern. You're not going to want to pull quite as tight as you did before. Just keep an eye on the stitches and see if you can kind of match that tension. Since everything's already snugged up, it doesn't feel like you have to wrench on it as hard. Finishing up this stitch, I'll go through that last hole but I'm going to go through it a second time to go around the outside. I usually do that when I start, but either when you start or when you finish up the stitch. I just like this short section that folds over to have that stitch around the outside. I find it just makes that look cleaner across that gap once it's folded over. And that's coming out from this side, and this is from before when we tied a knot. So I'm actually going to grab that and pull it through so I can just tie a knot on that side with those two ends. I'll just start with the single box knot. Put just a tiny dab of glue right on that spot. And again, this gets folded over so it's not super crucial that it's ultra clean looking. I'll go through twice. Lock that in. Maybe do one more just to make sure it's good. Let that dry and clip that excess off. And then by doing it that way, this end looks pretty clean. And what you're going to want to do now is 3 more of these. And then we're going to start sewing those together. It'll be 4 in a loop and then 4 on the other side. And we'll sew those on the ends. So once you get 2 of these done, you can sew them together. And then we'll sew it into a loop like this one. And you fold that short side over. But then those 2 parts will get sewn together to create the muff. So first things first, we'll get these 2 sides sewn together. Same as before, so now it's just 2 to 2 instead of just the ones. Same as before, slide that knot up to one of them holes. And then we'll go through that side. Same as before too, we're starting on that short end so these knots will get hidden. And I'll also go through again to go around the outside of that seam. Hold everything in place real nice. And then it's just the loop all the way down. And now that we got 4 of these sewn together, we can sew the ends together to make that circle. And you're going to have 2 of these when you're done. Same as before, make sure you're going to the short side first so you can hide those knots. And exactly the same thing we've been doing. Now with both of these done, you can fold this and tack it down. I usually like to do that if I really want that fold to stay. And you would just go through one of these stitches, tack it down to that side. It stays folded pretty nice where you want it, especially once it gets worn in. So either way, but the last step will be just to put those 2 sides together. You can stagger the seams if you want. I think it looks better if you put the seams right up to each other. And each side of that seam where that's sewn together, those 2 holes are treated as 2 separate holes. You'll just go to that side of the seam and then that side of the seam. I'll just tie a knot like I did before across this side first. You can do this in 2 sections. I have just one really long thread to go once around. If you don't like dealing with quite as much thread, you can go halfway and then tie it off and finish. I'm actually going to pull this through the other side right now. You can see I got quite a bit of thread, but I'd rather have less knots. You can clip it all the way around, or you can do a few at a time like I'm doing. I'll just throw a couple clips on at a time. And I'm looking at the holes still, making sure they go across. You can put a little something on the inside so it kind of holds it up for you. When you get to these corners, you can just go straight across them as if they weren't even there. And then just kind of try to make it look real nice as you're coming across. Looks fine. But what I prefer to do is come into this side, and instead of going straight across like you usually would, I'll go kitty corner. I find just having those little ends pop up nice without stitches going across them looks a little better. Either way works just fine. And then once you go across diagonally like that, you just continue on, same as you were before. Then just go straight through so it goes right over the top. Basically the same as we've been doing this whole time, and then all the way back to make that cross pattern. And once we get to there, we'll tie off that knot. So got this done, and there is some leniency as to how far back you want to put these folds. You can add glue in there if you just want them to hold down. You can put a stitch to hold it across there, and this would be the large. So I have one of the long fur ones here that will fold all the way back so it's fur all the way around instead of just being a cuff. And you'll see that I just did this on a machine instead, which you can do this one on a machine also if you wanted, and you could leave a little fur over it, or you could tuck it in like this. And one thing I did as well is on this middle seam, like I show in other videos, I trimmed some of that hair back because it's kind of hard getting that pinched in there on that center seam. There's quite a bit of fur and stuff getting mushed in there. But with this one, you can finish it on a machine however you want, but I have the holes in there to show how I would finish this if I was hand sewing it. You just fold these back, and I'll do kind of a blind stitch and then grab this center one every once in a while to hold that fold where I want it to be. Just to feel and get it folded right to that center. Same with this side. I'll start by just tying a knot so I'm not fighting the end of this string, making sure that it doesn't loosen up. Just tuck that excess in there. And this is like a blind stitching method. We're just going to go back and forth on each side here. And you can see those holes. If you need to trim the fur on that edge a little bit, you can. With that tied, try to get that folded up real close. I'll come straight across from where it's tied and come from the fur side through the hole and right back out again, holding that fur kind of out of the way. And I'll go right across to this side and do the same thing through and then back out the top again. And I just go back and forth. You'll see as you pull it together, if you tuck that seam down in there, it'll pull that seam together and tuck it down. But you can leave it a little bit looser as you go to make sure you can get in here. And then once you get further down, pull the beginning stitches tight. And if you really wanted to, you could just go from the back and down. The seam would get pushed up, but this is enough fur to cover it up. You should be all right. You'll see when I pull it, that seam gets tucked down in there, but I want it looser. So what I'll do is, once I go through this side, every like so many stitches, you know, every couple 3-4 inches or so, I'll go down this hole, but before I come back out, I'll actually go through that other seam underneath to hold it. You could do that, or you could put a little glue in there, or you could just leave it as is. It really shouldn't move around, but I almost always over-engineer stuff, overdo things, just to be sure. And then I'll come back out. That really pulls those together nice. You don't want to yank it too tight so it bunches it up. Just kind of keep an eye on that. And go all the way around.